And I'd now like to call on the presenters for the final session, which will be on transport energy. We have John Blackburn representing NRMA and Neil Greet representing Engineers Australia, who will talk to you about the key issues for the Green Paper on transport energy. Thank you, John.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. One point of clarification, I consult the NRMA, so I won't say I represent them. Peter's from the NRMA over here. But the NRMA has been funding some studies I've done over the last few years about transport energy, resilience and security. And the first thing I'd like to say is how pleased I was to see that 7 senators 2 weeks ago signed a motion for Senate inquiry into transport energy, security and resilience and sustainability. That goes up for report in March of next year. Submissions are due by November the 10th, so I'd encourage people to put into it. This is the cover of a report I wrote in March of this year. When I talk to a lot of people about fuel security or resilience, I generally get asked how much storage should we have and is the NRMA prepared to pay for this with its members? And when I talk about fuel resilience, it's not about storage. Storage is a part of it, but I use this little silly diagram when I talk to politicians and say it's about flow and the percentage of flow that you need to sustain essential functions, and that's what gives you your final bit of resilience in your society. So to look at the supply, to look at the processing and refining, the storage is a part of it, that's the spring, but also you have to look at demand. And if you don't look at that equation, you're not balancing it off. So this is not about storage. How do we compare to other countries in our approach to this? This is a bit of a study that will come out from the NRA once the Green Paper is issued, so that'll be the NRA's response to the Green Paper, is if you have a look at Australia, we have no mandated stocks on industry, but just examples of Korea and Japan, across into Europe where the EU has a minimum of 61 days real fuel stock holdings you must maintain in industry, or the 90 days net oil imports from the IEA, excuse me, whichever is the larger. The IEA figure is highly misleading. It's not 90 days of real fuel. I'll come to that later. Underneath the line there, I've just done a quick comparison of government-owned stocks of fuel. Australia has none. Korea 123, Japan 85, and you come across France 73. So it's quite interesting. Why are we different? So the next thing I did is I had a quick look at and compared 75 countries. The IEA countries are the light blue, non-IEA countries are dark blue. Whilst Canada's an IEA member country, they're a net exporter and they actually don't have government direction or ownership of the supply chain as such. When I looked at Australia, I found this rather worrying thing. We're the only oil importing country in the developed world that doesn't have any of these three things: public-owned stocks or mandated commercial stocks or some degree of government control over the supply chain. Everything's left up to the market, but we're the only one. Now, I could find one other one, and that was Zimbabwe. Now, I know we could benchmark some of our politicians against Zimbabwe, but I don't think it's a good benchmark for a nationally important, fundamental thing such as transport fuel resilience. So why is this different? Well, once a politician did tell me it's because we're an island continent. I did say, well, if we're an island continent, surely our supply chains are a little bit more risky than if you're in the middle of Europe, unless you're dependent on Russian gas. But no, there was a problem. So how have other countries treated this? Well, the G7 had a wonderful meeting in Rome in May, and the energy ministers came up with these statements: diversification and encouragement of indigenous sources of energy supply, putting in place emergency response systems, including reserves and fuel substitutions in case of major supply disruptions. And Para 8 said you can't build this according to market rules. Now, people say, well, it's just they're worried about Crimean gas. Well, 3 of those countries aren't worried about Crimean gas. In June of this year, the UK Energy Secretary stated this in his speech: energy security and resilience doesn't happen by accident. Planning to make it happen is incredibly meticulous. Often development in the security of markets requires direct political intervention. And that's why the statement of his speech was about active government and smart intervention. Now, if the G7's doing this and the POMs are doing it, why aren't we? Is it because we know a lot more than they are? We're special? We must have something that gives us this wonderful warm feeling inside us. So these are the two reports I did. I'm going to talk about a few things. Margaret's graph at the front was really interesting when we talked about the lack of diversity of energy supplies in the transport sector. But here's a graph from the IEA. It shows how things have changed since 1973. Industry on the left, transport in the centre and other sectors on the right. Agriculture, of course, is totally dependent on transport. But if you look at that, there's a bit more worrying story. Something's happened in the other sectors that hasn't happened in transport. And meanwhile, I'm told figures of up to about $5 billion a year go into subsidies into transport sectors. Some examples before of what we're paying the mines to do to make it inefficient. Only 5% of our transport on the East Coast is by rail. Not exactly a good efficiency in terms of energy, but a whole bunch of reasons why it happens. So there's one of the stories. Basically, we import 91% of all our transport fuel, either as oil or refined product. Only 10% currently comes from Australian oil. And here's the graph over time. About 60% import dependence back in 2000, today at 91%. But this graph actually doesn't tell the whole story. Because since 2012, we're now losing 40% of our refining industry. So when you add on that refining industry loss, you start to see another picture emerge. And here it is, 7 refineries in 2004 and 2015. 40% loss. In 2003, we used to refine 113% of our domestic fuel requirement. By the middle of next year, we'll be refining 48%. And when I speak to the department, this is not the Green Paper team, but I've been dealing with the Department of Industry, or RET as it was. What I got told, which surprised me, is that people in there working on these policy issues were quite happy for us to have no refining capacity in Australia. Leave it totally to the market. Now, having had 33 years in defence and spent a lot of time being paranoid about scenarios, I got a little concerned because I've actually seen in my previous life a lot of the classified stuff behind why we spend $25 or $26 billion a year on defence. And it's not just to have nice shiny aeroplanes, although I do appreciate those. So let's have a look at, here's the IEA stock holdings, and we are, with 60-day holdings in October 2012, we had 71 days, so a year ahead later, we had 60 days net import holdings. We're the only non-compliant country in the IEA. But I've got to tell you, even if we met that IEA standard, it would make bugger all difference to our resilience. It's a net import stock holding. It's not real consumption in country. It's a long story to go into, so I won't do that. But basically, the Australian Institute of Petroleum was saying about this time we had about 3 weeks of fuel in the country. I don't agree with that figure because I've seen other data that proves it's far less. The other thing is if we close down our refineries, we'll be joining the Luxembourg as the only other IEA member country without a refinery. So you could choose, I guess, Zimbabwe, Luxembourg. We're heading in that direction. The graph at the top shows what the AIP says. Now, they're the lobby group for the fuel and oil industry. They were reporting stock holdings in the path here of about 23 days. If you look at the BRE data, they said about 12 days average for diesel last year. I've seen non-published reports that show the fuel stock holdings by category. That's the important thing. It doesn't care if you've got 23 days if you can't use that for what you need. But if your aviation fuel goes as low as 3 days, and when we've had supply problems, tankers contaminated, supply gets disrupted within 2 days, when you look at the components you use, diesel, aviation fuel and a few others, it is far less than that. Also, if you don't have a refinery in your state, the actual stock holding at the product terminals and service stations is quite low. There are no public stock holdings, and here's the kicker. There's no mandated reporting, so we actually don't know what's in the stock holding because industry does not report it. So right now, our whole resilience depends upon faith in those large fuel and oil companies making sure the supply happens. Their responsibility is for reliability of supply, not security. I was told that face-to-face by a CEO of one of the large fuel companies in Australia. Reliability of supply, not security. Yet we're happy to outsource to the market the security of our supply. A bit strange. So if you look at what's actually in the shops, thanks to improved supply chain efficiencies, things are getting pretty low. Some stuff is down to less than a week, and if anybody panics at any second, then you've lost it. So I went to my local pharmacy, because I know people are actually pharmacy supply chains. But the pharmacist said, look, I've got about 7 days, but when you actually look at critical stock holdings, one bit of panic, and we're down to about 2 days, and then we're really wrecked for our older patients. We've got a serious health problem on our hands. But everything's that tight because it makes financial sense. Oh, by the way, some of the fuel stocks get run down at the end of the year because an American company reports its financial state at the end of the calendar year. And what happens at the end of the year? Harvest season. So when my brother-in-law couldn't bring the crop off the farm in late 2012 in Victoria because the Geelong refinery went offline and 2 days later there was no diesel in northwest Victoria or Gippsland, and he and his mates were driving across the border in utes trying to get diesel from New South Wales to bring back, one would suggest the depth of supply and resilience is very, very low. So, what's the supply? And I'm not an economist, I'm not a logistician, but I just said, well, if you look at the supply chain from resources, trade, shipment, ports, refining, transport, storage, supply and demand, if you were going to do a risk analysis, you'd want to look at a whole bunch of aspects of that to make sure you understood the risks you faced and therefore the policy you were putting in place. The 2011 National Energy Security Assessment looked at 2 scenarios only. That was a repeat of the Middle East oil interruption from the 70s, or a 30-day outage of Singapore production. It then did an economic analysis that said there was about a $2.5 billion cost to the economy if Singapore went out for 30 days. That, I understand, was one of the decisions why $9 billion to fix up the IEA storage, which is pointless anyway, or $2.5 billion economic impact. You can understand why government would say, hang on, this doesn't make sense. Now, was anything else in the supply chain analysed? Did anybody analyse the impacts of a conflict or a serious period of tension in the South China Sea? Now, if you're a European and you saw what's happened to Crimea and the Ukraine and you're dependent on gas, and you started to hear about the cyber attack on the Norwegian gas system recently, which is the only other gas supply, you'd probably get a little bit worried about energy to be used as a weapon against you. So therefore, if we're so dependent on imports, you'd expect that the analysis would be done. It has not been done. So the 2012 Energy White Paper was based on an energy security assessment that was outsourced to a consulting company that did those 2 scenarios. And oh, by the way, when I spoke to the department, the 2014 NESA, which was being programmed for a while, I'm told, cannot be completed before the 2014 Energy White Paper is produced because the White Paper got accelerated 12 months. Now, I'm not having a go at the department here. My whole focus is the government. If you accelerate a White Paper and don't think about the steps necessary to provide a competent and credible analysis, then they are deficient as political leaders. So my comments are nothing to do with the team here. It's all about the government. That's the level of analysis that's gone into it. That's where the vast majority of our refined fuels come from. Now, again, with a defence background, I have spent a lot of time in my career looking at that area. We think Crimea is a problem. Yeah, can you imagine what's going to happen up here? So, where is the vector? I would maintain that we have good control over about 10% of our sources. The market does, under the vast majority of circumstances, provide reliable supply for the rest. Would I want my security and safety dependent on the market? No, I wouldn't. This is why I do what I do. The infrastructure's in decline. We're losing a lot of our refining industry. When I talk to the large companies, is there any reason why they think they're going to maintain a refining industry in country? And I can't find anybody to tell me they're going to. The BP refinery in Brisbane, that's closing down next year, was one of our newer ones. When you look at the fuel demand, it's increasing for a range of issues. Consumer behaviour, vehicle consumption standards, subsidies, transport substitution. There's an interesting graph of the new vehicle fleet fuel efficiency standards, showing Australia's about half the fuel efficiency of EU and Japan. Interesting work by Climate Works came out recently that said if we purely adopted those EU standards, this is the effect by 2024. 66 million barrels of oil reduction per year, that amount of CO2 reductions, that amount of dollar savings. Those vehicles are available. The same vehicles we buy and import into Australia are available at those EU standards. It might cost $1,500 more per vehicle, but the life cycle cost is lower. This is why you can't just wait for people to want to import what vehicle they want, because very few people do a life cycle cost of anything they buy. So you have to educate, engage and show them. And in some cases, if it makes sense into balancing some of the demand, regulate efficiency standards both for environmental reasons and also for international fuel flow reasons. In other words, there are places I think government has to do something. What am I arguing in the reports? We need to reduce our demand. That's pretty straightforward. And there's a lot of things you could do on that. And some of that demand reduction looks at alternates in country. Decide what proportion of our fuel supply needs to be secure. Nobody has done that analysis ever. Determine the least costly way of achieving it. And that's a supply and demand trade-off. And if some things like fuel efficiency can be mandated and achieve a proportion of that, it would seem pretty obvious to do it. Institute measures to ensure appropriate secure sources of supply, complemented by sufficient refining or processing and storage in Australia. It's a fine balance. It's not a simple answer anywhere. My main focus is the risk analysis necessary to inform a decision of this seriousness has never been done and is not being done now to the best of my knowledge. What could we do? These are some examples of previous NMRA studies and reports. Gas to liquids, biofuels, CPG, LPG, electric vehicles, other fuel sources. That's a feasible mix according to a bunch of CSIRO scientists who did the study. Since I started this, I went and bought an electric vehicle and put solar on the roof. But I tell you what, driving the electric vehicle changes how I drive the other car, which is a diesel. I actually start to understand fuel consumption efficiency, energy efficiency. I'm a bit paranoid because I sit there on my computer, I can see my house energy consumption and actual production. But I actually changed the way I've driven the diesel car because I've learnt to drive differently thanks to an electric car. So I've got to tell you, this is not about just giving consumers choice. You have to give them experience, and you take something to them and help the public understand. Is it feasible for us to have 30% of our supply secure? A mixture of oil and also other alternates? I believe it is, and that includes electric vehicles. Is that sufficient? I don't know the answer. But the important point there is neither does anybody else. So if we're going to do an energy security assessment and white paper, I argue at least that sort of analysis needs to be done, and it needs to be done competently. We have the skill sets across government to do it. We don't have the political will or leadership to actually initiate that. It's not a departmental problem. This is a leadership problem in government. So here's a summary. We're the 9th largest energy producer in the world. Abundant renewable and non-renewable energy sources. I think as Senator Hill said a couple of years or a year or so ago, unlike the Americans whose domestic energy policy is priority number 1 and exports is number 2, we've inverted that. We're over 90% dependent for transport fuels and imports. We have very small consumption stock holdings. I think somewhere at most 7 to 14 days, depending on which category you're looking at. The IAS stock holding obligations are just an example of how we don't comply with our international obligations. The last thing I would suggest is that we try and meet that 90-day net import holdings. It's just not a relevant figure. At least 40% of our refining capacity is disappearing over this 2 or 3 years. There is no stated policy to retain any refining capacity. The day we close the last refinery, we're 100% import dependent. So we're spending billions of dollars on military gear, and you can't use it unless you've actually got somebody in that region who's going to send you the fuel. Just-in-time oil and fuel supply chains are well under normal circumstances and with small-scale or very short duration interruptions. The resilience has not been tested under a set of plausible scenarios. So if we're using some sets of scenarios for the $25 billion a year we put into defence, my question is, why don't you use those same regional security assessments for something as fundamental as energy and at least understand the risks? We don't have to invent anything. That information is in government. We're relying on global oil and fuel markets to give reliability and security of supply. But if a CEO of one of those companies says to me, it's not my job, I tend to believe the CEO. And I've got nothing against the oil and fuel companies. They're doing what they're there to do. Reliability of supply, profit for the shareholders, and they're maintaining their brand. It is not their job to look after our security. And I view that our society is at significant risk if any of the assumptions contained in the vulnerability assessments we've done to date prove false. The Japanese found that at Fukushima. Their reports after the fact showed how their assumptions had blinded them to risk. What we are doing in this country is we are blind to the risk because our supply chains have changed fundamentally, not only just in fuel, in a whole range of other areas over the last decades. And we're blind to the risk. That's the link to the report, so if you want to look at that. And I'll now hand over to Neil.
All right, good afternoon and thanks John. Thank you Ken and to the Energy Change Institute for inviting me here. And also thank you to Margaret and your team for actually sticking it out to the end. But more importantly, to the people who've stuck around to the end, we always get leakage, so thanks very much for staying around. But I'm now between you and the drinks, because I guess if you've stayed now, you'll stay to the drinks, all right? So I do understand the imperatives, all right? Yes, my name's Neil Greet. I'm representing Engineers Australia. I've recently co-authored a report on energy security for Engineers Australia, and this report will be launched at our convention in November of this year. And I'll just quickly rattle through a few words. I don't have any slides, so hopefully the voice will keep you entertained. Our relationship with John and NRMA on fuel security is building out of a common concern. Our major concern is with what might be termed longer-term capability drivers of fuel security. Resilience is the word. It's all about resilience. With less need for fuel infrastructure in Australia, the engineering jobs have already shifted offshore to reflect the market reality. And this has been of no concern because the engineering profession that supports the petroleum industry is by nature international, mobile, very technical and quite small. However, it is the follow-on loss of skilled engineering in research and development, coupled with practical ability to innovate, that concerns Engineers Australia the most. It is not surprising that the growth of the engineering profession has been driven by the construction boom associated with mining and also the increased telecommunication needs of the last 2 decades. A deficit of homegrown qualified engineers saw migrant engineering intake expand rapidly throughout the last decade. Now that growth in engineering jobs has declined to normal levels, and coupled with the compounding continual decline of manufacturing in Australia, there are now some concerning demographics confronting the engineering profession, and we believe more widely the professional skilled workforce in Australia. The Engineers Australia 2013 report on the statistics of the profession indicates that there was a workforce of some 320,000 engineers in Australia, but only 62% of engineers were in engineering jobs, meaning that there was about some 520,000 engineers in the workforce in Australia. While the raw number is low, the jobs are highly skilled, and importantly, those engineers not working as engineers specifically contribute to the highest levels of management in the country. And I think we've already seen that in some of the people that have presented today and that diversity. And it's across diverse industries such as fuel, energy, waste, and so on, not just mining and construction. In order for the Australian industry to successfully compete in a global market, it must employ high-level thinkers who have the acquired skills mixed with creativity and originality to develop new innovations. In addition to this, managers in the industry must possess advanced management skills to underpin a competitive knowledge, manufacturing and industrial environment. Engineers are major drivers of those advanced technologies and innovations which form the foundations of the future. Innovative engineering processes are steadily replacing traditional methods in Australia, and it's important this movement is maintained to transform Australia to a high-tech, knowledge-based economy. And Engineers Australia supports the view that industry and governments play a fundamental role in driving the transition in order to successfully compete on a world stage. So that's all well and good. That's what we want to do. The problem for engineering is that why would an industry that is determined to provide fuel security through others invest in research and development of supporting petroleum technologies here? Why invest in universities to educate young chemical and mechanical engineers that an industry does not need here? Our universities will not be able to attract bright young engineering students from overseas to some of our engineering faculties if we cannot maintain high skills in high-end engineering. How will we be able to continue to communicate the important role of science, technology, engineering and maths, STEM, to young people and to the entire community? We are fast losing that battle. But the most concerning issue is how do we innovate and continue to invest in research and development, which everyone says we will do, if the engineering base is not there because we have outsourced our security? The connection that we believe in and what attracts us to the compelling example of fuel security by John and the NRMA is the limitations and the effect on the engineering capability. It has already affected jobs. It will affect engineering skilling, training and education, and ultimately it will retard innovation and research and development. That is why we believe fuel security must be looked at from a multi-dimensional national resilience perspective. The uncertainty around our domestic fuel supply is one of many reasons why Australia needs to ensure that resilience and security are core components of not only a national energy strategy, but also our national infrastructure strategy. This is a policy consideration that must involve coordination across sector, portfolio and jurisdiction lines. Now that leads me to the bigger issue of energy security. Engineers Australia embarked upon a policy review of energy security in May of last year, partly because we saw bigger issues in energy, with fuel being a critical subset, and also because 86% of the 2012 member survey felt energy was the single biggest issue affecting the profession into the future. Australia needs a much broader understanding of energy security than the one that policymakers currently use. The existing one is too narrowly focused on economic harm arising from a loss of supply and gives insufficient attention to the fact that energy security is a multidimensional concept entwined with issues across the social, political, economic and environmental spectrum. The consequence of this restricted definition means that energy security is framed in a narrow way, limiting energy security policy attention to a few issues. This also reduces the opportunity for systemic engagement with other policy areas that can both worsen energy securities or build security. This is because the areas of energy-related concern for those areas such as agriculture, water, sustainability and social policy do not commonly fall within the boundaries of what is deemed to be energy security, and issues like fuel security are considered to be outside of that consideration. Instead, Australia needs a comprehensive understanding of energy security that explicitly recognises both sides of the demand-supply relationship, and that energy insecurities arise across the four key domains of national, economic and national security, food and water security, sustainable development and environmental security, and finally, social stability and energy stress or energy poverty. Supply and demand, which reflect the producers' and consumers' perspectives respectively, can be both tightly and loosely coupled. Sometimes both demand and supply are within the control of domestic government policy, and it is then logical to develop policy that influences both simultaneously. However, sometimes the Australian government cannot have a significant influence on one side of the demand-supply equation, and it makes sense to develop policy for each separately. The four key domains are the lens that stakeholders use to identify how energy insecurities arise or how energy security can be obtained in relation to the other areas of concern. The domains shape how the stakeholders frame and identify energy security threats, likelihoods, consequences, and solutions. That is, understanding the full gambit of risk. Using a comprehensive understanding of energy security that incorporates these two issues, the supply-demand relationship and the four key domains, policymakers will better balance the often competing and conflicting interests that are involved in energy issues. Such a comprehensive approach to energy security policy developments has a far greater chance of developing policies that are both successfully implemented and enduring. Conversely, it will reduce the chance of unintended consequences and the formation of coalitions that seek to undermine policy decisions because of their adverse impacts on their interests. Now let me just say that again. It will reduce the chance of unintended consequences and the formation of coalitions that seek to undermine policy decisions because of the adverse impacts on their interests. Our report makes a series of recommendations aimed at implementing a comprehensive approach to energy security policy through the following initiatives, and some of these have been mentioned today. Adopting a comprehensive energy security definition that is relevant to Australia. Treating energy security as a wicked problem. Broadening the understanding of threats to energy security. Reducing energy consumption. Securing the energy wealth for future Australians. Integrating energy security and defence policy. Integrating energy security and foreign diplomacy. Addressing liquid fuel insecurity. Addressing energy poverty. Moving beyond energy infrastructure protection. And finally, the big one, which has been latent, I think, in everyone's presentations, about engaging the community and how we change the narrative that exists. So, If I might just digress to a short story about the harder side of security, about the military back in 1990, when the Americans were first talking about complex warfighting. That word complex, Margaret, right? Lieutenant General Krulak of the US Marines was promoting this idea of three-block war, which was about essentially the complex situations that have since arisen in that time. However, in order to make change, it took till 2007 in Iraq before the strategies ever changed and ever the complex warfighting was really adapted by the Americans. The problem is it took the levelling of Fallujah twice, and it took the loss of many American lives before they actually changed. Now, why I mention that sort of harder story of national security is because people understood that there was a new type of warfare on the way. They understood that it was going to be very complex, but it was impossible to change the conventional wisdom that was around at the time. And it took a big smack before people changed conventional wisdom. So that's your challenge, Margaret. It's very complex, but there's been shed loads of conventional wisdom, and there is. So on that note, I'd open the floor to questions to John and I.